All right. So I just want to say, Conrad asked at what point, what would the alternative be? My suggestion would be anything that didn't end in an authoritarian, indeed draconianly authoritarian system, and tens of millions of people dying. Right. So I'll just give two parallel examples here. Right. On the lower estimate of people who were killed by Chairman Mao, the lower estimate. Right. So I'm being as conservative as possible. He's estimated to have killed about 15 million people in peacetime. Right. Absolutely no one. If I told them, no leftists certainly, if I told them that King Leopold III only killed 10 million people in the Belgian Congo, would say, well, the arc of history required that this be done in order to help develop the Congo and the rubber industry, so we can give Leopold a pass on this because of all the historical roles that he played. No, he committed a genocide in the Congo. He's been rightly called out for that routinely by the left. And I don't understand why it is that somebody who killed far more people, even on a conservative estimate than King Leopold, should be given a pass, like Chairman Mao, whereas Leopold will be rightly the subject of our reprobations. Or let's take Stalin, right? It's estimated that about 4 million people died in the Great Bengal famine in India. And I still routinely see British imperialists say things like, well, but British imperialism did so much. You can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs. Think about all the institutions and mechanisms that we built in India. Maybe worth the price of those 4 million. Well, the lower estimate in the Holodomor is that about 5 million people died as a result of starvation in Ukraine, right? And I don't know many leftists who will sit there and say, you know what, they are actual British imperialists are right. The Great Bengal famine played a necessary historical role in modernizing India, so we're going to give them a pass. And if we're not going to give them a pass, I'm not sure why it is that we should ever give Stalin or Stalinism a pass in any sense, right? And if you're asking what kind of alternatives might have been pursued, I'm well aware of the fact that these are both developing states that were crippled in many circumstances by wartime. But we shouldn't let people off the hook for the bad things they do on that basis. And there are alternative models of socialism that worked far more successfully. Right? And this is the point that I made when ruminating about Nordic socialism in my recent review of Dragsted's book. Right? I can appreciate the kind of ultra-left critique that says that Nordic socialism is incomplete, problematic, et cetera, in many respects. Right? But you don't sit there and say, well, so far, rockets have only gotten us to the moon. We want to get to Mars. So fuck it. Why don't we just sit there and design a rocket from scratch? Maybe that will get us to Mars. No, you sit there and you say, these people have gotten to the moon. They've designed successful social democratic societies that are far more free and far more equal than any other that have been created in the world. That will be our model going forward. And we will see if we can push further than that. But I just cannot see any kind of circumstance in which making reference to Stalinist or Maoist models is going to get us anywhere strategically. And I think that morally, it's just a catastrophe to try to exonerate those kinds of figures because they don't deserve exoneration. What they deserved was a lifetime in jail.
Well, I want to go back to Conrad, obviously, but I do just want to, I don't think anybody's confused about what my perspective is on this, but just to, sort of push the obvious challenge.
Oh, sorry, Leopold II. Yes, not Leopold III.
Okay, well, that's
got my Leopold's.
Thank God we corrected that. Okay, so I did just want to push the obvious challenge, which is like, okay, Norwegian social democracy is great for Norway, but would that really have been an option for, say, China in the 1940s, right? Like that in other words, how relevant is it to Conrad's original question about what the alternative would be for those societies?
I'm not sure how successfully those kind of models could have been implemented there, right? But I would say that the comparison is not as unusual as one might think, unless one thinks in terms of scale, right? So Norway, Sweden, Denmark were highly inegalitarian societies in the 19th century, riven with class conflict. In many cases, there were revolutions and wars that broke out between them. And it was a kind of social democracy that not only brought peace, but unity to these states, right? By allowing a high degree of freedom and participation in politics, and indeed in the economy where workers had long been shut out, while later in the 1950s and 60s implementing the kind of welfarist measures for which these societies are well known, and that become characteristic of their successes, right? Now, is this model exportable to a country of the scale of the Soviet Union or China? I don't know, right? But again, I think that's strategically, they are much better reference points for us to be pointing to for what we would like to achieve than Maoism or Stalinism or Soviet-style communism or anything of that sort. And I just think morally, there is no comparison between the two. Without a doubt, there's abundant failures that you can point to in Nordic social democracy. But those failures do not include killing 15 million people during peacetime, right? Or allowing 7 million people to starve to death while you're collectivizing the agricultural industry, right? I just don't really think that there's any kind of situation in which we can say the arc of the moral universe is sufficiently long that we can kind of push those things to the side because the benefits are worth it.
Okay, so I have many thoughts, but I had sort of lobbed a challenge at Conrad's view earlier, and he never got a chance to respond to that. And then there's this new one now, so let's just give Conrad a chance to talk for a while.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So first of all, and I just want to make clear before advancing, whatever justifications might be advanced for what really amount to developmental dictatorships that delink from the world market with a kind of socialist inspiration, I think ultimately is what they became. That's not something that I'm advocating in the present for Western societies. So I want to be clear about that. Nevertheless, I think that the debate has important resonances regarding the way that we pursue our activism in the present. But going over to Matt's point, I want to say, first of all, and I'll respond to Matt first, then I'll move over to you. I want to say, first of all, that I want to make an initial objection, which is that, I think that the language of killed is itself very loaded. Of course, we know that, Mao didn't, personally go and stab these people. And
Eichmann didn't personally kill any Jews either, right? He just organized the train tables.
Well, of course, but then even that is very different, right? So if we look at, the Great Leap Forward, that was a policy failure that led to a famine. Of course, if we look at recent Chinese history, we'll find that, China had suffered many of the largest famines in history prior to that, in terms of, partly because of their population, in terms of the breadth, and that was also the last famine they ever suffered, which tells us something else, which is that the communists ultimately extinguished the conditions whereby famines would actually happen. If we look at the Cultural Revolution, my understanding is that most of the deaths arose from basically internecine factional fighting. Of course, we know that many occasions the government actually brought in the military to try to stop violence from occurring. I think that the overall death rate in the population at that time was lower than COVID in the United States. Of course, COVID is a very, very politicized phenomenon. I think the US Victims for Communism Foundation claim that all COVID deaths should be listed as deaths by communism because COVID came out of China, to give you an idea of how politically manipulable that is. So then the question becomes, if we look at what happened in the United States, which was, very clearly, corporations and the super rich trotting out arguments about personal freedom in order to safeguard the reproduction of capital, even as 1 million or more people were dying. Do we say that, well, they killed those people, right? So I want to alert you, to, I think, the extremely political nature of this kind of rhetoric.
Okay, but allow me to retort, right? I absolutely blame George W. Bush for what happened in New Orleans in the 2000s. Because he did very, very little when a bad circumstance emerged and supported the kinds of policies that made it far easier for many, many people to die when the hurricane swept in. That does not mean I think that George W. Bush personally went and killed all those people. That means I think that his policies are to blame and the ideology that backs those policies are to blame for bringing about those conditions.
Well, so I'm also curious because I believe the last, because we were talking about the China-India comparison earlier,
or that was the next one I was going to bring up. Yeah, I do not think that the people who brought about the Great Bengal famine were personally sitting there hoping that millions of people were going to die. And yet you would not find a single leftist alive who would sit there and say, well, British imperialism bears no blame or no severe blame for the conditions that brought about the Great Bengal famine. Because they didn't consciously intend to kill those.
Which is also, it's maybe worth pointing out, was I believe the last major famine in India, right? Is in 1943, which just goes to the point maybe that developmentalism in general. I think you can credit for creating a world with fewer famines, but
well, and yet every 8 years they have a greater death count than the Great Leap Forward because of the failure to create conditions that would arrest that, right? So that's. But the other point I want to make here is that I think that and I think
which is to the very great discredit of Indian capitalism, right? I mean, like in other words, like it's not. I guess I'm just curious about the, I think the main value, right, of thinking through comparisons would be to make sure we're applying consistent standards, right?
Well,
so
and let's look at this systemically, right? Because not only did they, e.g., right, in spite of suffering that famine, which they do deserve some blame for, no doubt. I wouldn't use the language of killed, but of course there's plenty of blame, and terrible mistakes that were made. But I will say this, I think that for many people in the world, I think that, to draw an analogy between British colonialism and domestic governments that, whatever their mistakes, had the fundamental goal of, elevating, improving conditions for the population, resisting colonialism, would be to many people in the world offensive. And this isn't just some sort of speculation that lacks a statistical basis. I mean, when Mao took power, the average lifespan in China was 35 years old. It was the second poorest country in the entire world. When he left power, it was 65. Right. And this is not to speak of, education, infrastructure, healthcare, and all of that. So, whatever kind of, the imperialists built trains, whatever marginal gains that we can talk about being accrued in that context, we know well that they're ultimately enormously dwarfed by, the immense suffering, by the repressions in development that were implemented. If you look at these countries, and I think it's well understood by much of the world that this was a huge net gain, right? If we talk about that period, even if we do hold account, right, for the severity of these particular episodes. So I don't think you can really analogize like a British.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree with you that it's very difficult to analogize these two things, right? Because 4 to 5 million people died in the Great Bengal famine. 15 million people on the lowest estimation died because of Mao's policies, right? So without a doubt, right, looks like Churchill comes across looking a lot better than Chairman Mao does, at least when it comes to bringing about worldwide famines, right? And I absolutely can guarantee you, if you looked at any British imperialist and their justification for what they're doing, they would say exactly the same kind of things that people are using to apologize for the Maoist regime, right? Well, they didn't intend to bring about these deaths. They were expecting to do this for the sake of the people. Really, they just wanted to develop the Indian subcontinent so eventually they could obtain home rule, right? So there's even a kind of liberationist quality to it you often see in kind of imperialist kinds of argumentation, right? I just don't think that there is any circumstance in which you can sit there and say that this is a model for emulation, right? It brought about catastrophic death. Did some good emerge from that? Sure, right? But I don't think that any of the 15 million people, again, on the conservative estimate, who died would think that that was a price that was worth paying.
I mean, some good. I mean, 800 million people have been raised out of poverty, right? And this has been the most significant anti-poverty alleviation project in human history. So I think that, and we could look at other statistics here. I mean, my understanding is that, due to British policies in India, we have 40 million people dying between 1880 and 1920, right? That was something that I looked at the other day. So we blame
very rightly imperialism and capitalism for bringing about those deaths. And we also blame the people who are at the head of those systems for bringing about those deaths.
Right, but there's a fundamental difference, right, between imposing like an extractivist policy that represses overall development conditions, right, and stuttering and suffering on the way to what most people in the world, certainly outside of the West, understand was an enormous net positive.
I mean, I don't know about that, Conrad. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Latin America, and I don't really know a lot of leftists there who have Chairman Mao posters in their offices and say, this is what we want to emulate.
I mean, look, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism is like the most active form of, we could talk about India, we could talk about the Philippines, we could talk about, it's the most active militant form of Marxist activism in the world that exists today. So we can't sit here and pretend that there isn't all kinds of people, who see that, and not necessarily in Canada, not necessarily in Sweden, but they're
not necessarily in Latin America either.
Yeah, not necessarily in Latin America. That very well-known bastion of support for American imperialism and American capitalism, right, where everybody just has Ronald Reagan posters everywhere, right? What I'm just suggesting, right, again, is that we hold ourselves to a very consistent standard here. If it is wrong for capitalists and imperialists to bring about a famine that resulted in the death of 4 million people, and we rightly hold those people to blame for that and say you should have done better. Even if you didn't aim a gun at that person and shoot them, you deserve a lot of blame for that. We cannot sit there and exonerate Maoists or Chairman Mao for bringing about the death, again, on a very conservative estimation. The likely number is far higher, for bringing out the death of 15 million people by saying, well, it's a tragedy, right? It's not a tragedy, right? There were ways of preventing this from happening. I appreciate that some good may have come from it, and I see that as a silver lining, but that doesn't exonerate those people and that system for what occurred. And again, I would stress that if Mao were here today, I would say that there's a very nice, cozy room for him in The Hague where he should go with all the other people who brought about mass death and human
the Chinese government, in fact, acknowledges these as failures, right? So like this wouldn't be saying anything that's like shocking to China. I think the crucial difference in the narrative is that they, with good reason, right, looking at what they accomplished overall and comparing it to, you know, colonial or non-Western parts of the world, understand that there was an enormous net benefit. So if you're talking about those particular episodes, I would say yes, and I would say that that's acknowledged in China as well. But if we're talking about the totality of the arc of development, I think it's enormously positive. Right?
Yeah, I mean, look, development is good. I would also note that that in India, for example, in the early 1900s, life expectancy was about 25. You know, now it's about 70. You have similar, you know, like the basic arc of you know, economic development, you know, taking away the sort of really extreme forms of poverty in the developing world has played out in a variety of different countries with different systems. I think what you can accurately say in, you know, like in the Chinese case is that it happened it happened at a much more rapid pace there, although that was also mostly, you know, post Mao. I mean, it seems like under Mao, you had the usual arc of the capital C communist countries where, you know, there's this sort of initial spurt of development and industrialization, and then things tend to economically plateau. It seems like the real Chinese economic miracle was under Dengism, right? You know, which you know, might be, you know, whatever lesson you want to learn from that. I'm not convinced that it's like massively, like, again, unusually successful in terms of the short time frame. I think there are things you could say about that, about the large role of the state, you know, in the larger role of the state in economic development. I'm not convinced that it's massively qualitatively different from developmentalist stories in you know, unambiguously capitalist countries. And maybe this goes back to, I'll just refer people to, well, it's actually not out yet, but eventually you can watch me and Conrad going back and forth about this on C. Derek Varn's podcast. I think that's coming out later this summer. We pre-recorded it, but I did just want to, like, in our last.
If I could just add one qualification, right?
Okay, make it really quick, because I do want to loop back to a subject that we lost before, and I do want to, if possible, give Conrad the last word. But you were saying, Matt?
Sure. Well, I mean, you're talking about, could there be alternatives, right? Is there another way forward, right? Just look at Brazil, right? Brazil was a country that was governed by a right-wing authoritarian regime, far closer to the imperialist core. Lula helped lift, 23 million people out of poverty, and recently in 2023, the poverty rate in Brazil has fallen to its lowest level since he left office, right? That is a very clear example to me that there was a democratic, productive, fast path forward in the developing world. Indeed, in a country that's poorer than China, that didn't require millions of deaths and an authoritarian regime centered around a cult of personality. I mean, I like Lula, right? But I don't know anyone, even Michael Brooks, who sat there and a big Chairman Lula poster in his room and said, you know, whatever Chairman Lula says, I go for.
Well, I actually can say from experience that he did have a picture of Lula in his apartment.
Oh, well, there you go.
It was.
I retract that then.
It was the photo from when he interviewed him. But
by the way, fun fact for you. And I will say this, Ben, to your point. The Mao period recorded the highest growth rates in human history that were only later eclipsed in the Deng period. So at that time, that was the fastest development anyone had ever seen, and then it went even faster thereafter. So sometimes we talk about how it was really the Deng period when things kicked off.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think that this is also a narrative that is very expedient for capitalist purposes, because what's kind of ignored is the vastness of the foundations that were created. that actually made China an attractive receptacle for foreign investment compared to, say, India. Before, India policies in favor of foreign investment, right?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly have, some of the most massive rapid development in history, before that, right, was in the Soviet Union in the 30s. I mean, even if you read Trotsky at the beginning of the revolutionary trade, he goes on and on about this, about how, like, the rest of the world's having a depression, and look at how many tractors they're building, look at how much, look at all these amazing, statistics, which he was using as evidence for the existence of this, like, promising kind of core of new, mode of production, even under the distortions of Stalinism. But notably, right, that was very short-lived, right? I mean, those were the, like, first couple of decades, right? I mean, the Soviet Union didn't sort of maintain that kind of development. And so so my claim, and maybe
you are right about that, in China too,
yeah. So
Eric Hobsbawm actually has a really good account for that, where he points out that GDP growth actually capped out in the Soviet Union in the 1950s in the post-war period. I know Hobsbawm is a Marxist, right? So he's not very ideological driven about this. But he points out that after the Soviet Union essentially industrialized and provided a lot of very basic public goods for people that the factories produced, it became a lot harder for the system to operate because now the need was to move towards a more consumer-based economy centered around basically not quite luxury goods, but less immediately important goods, right? Televisions, hamburgers, that kind of stuff. And the system had a very hard time adjudicating how much of these things to produce without things like prices.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.